It seems that after every federal election, there are calls for electoral reform. Interestingly enough, the Conservative Party actually had the most votes, but not the most seats. In studio now to discuss this is a very familiar face, Dr. Geoffrey Hale, political science professor at the U of L. Welcome back to BCN.
Good to be back with you, Hal.
So a lot of Albertans are really frustrated. They say, well, as soon as Ontario and Quebec votes, it's all over for us. You know, they've got the most amount of seats and it's done.
Well, if you want to be competitive, you have to be competitive in multiple regions of the country. And the Conservatives held on to what they had in Quebec, but they didn't make any gains in Ontario. And if you don't do that, you can't win a federal election.
So what hurt cheer the most in Ontario? Many people thought the 416, Toronto was going to be the Liberals. Okay, that's fine, but what about the 905? You know, the Oakvilles, the Oshawas, Hamiltons.
I think a lot of that was the Doug Ford factor. Mr. Ford came in after a very tired, somewhat corrupt Liberal government in 2018, and his first year was a fiasco. There was all sorts of cronyism. There were very clumsily managed budget reductions, and so the reputation of the Conservatives for competence was blown out of the window from the get-go. You add to that the fact that the Conservatives put all the goodies in the shop window in the first 2 or 3 weeks of the campaign, and then they come out with their balancing reductions for infrastructure spending. And what do they need in suburban Toronto? They need more highways, they need more transit.
And the Gardner Expressway is falling apart. Yeah.
And you take it away from them, and people say, how are we going to get to and from work in less than an hour? And so people voted their pocketbook. People voted for the people they knew rather than the people they didn't know.
Okay, that's good. Can you explain how our national riding and seat distribution system really works?
Well, this is a hybrid system. We have basically the historical representation for the Atlantic provinces, which was set in amber in 1915, when Manitoba and Saskatchewan were threatening to fall below that threshold because of shifts in population. Their seat totals were frozen in 1985. These were based on constitutional amendments, so you can't change this without the consent of the provinces in question, and we're talking about 6 out of the 10 Canadian provinces. Therefore, unfortunately, while you can increase the number of members in Alberta, Ontario, and British Columbia, you can't really have equity unless you have a much, much larger parliament.
Wow. Yeah, I was going to ask, is there any way we could potentially change things so that various regions could have that equal and proper representation?
Well, given the fact that the amendment formula requires 7 provinces with 50% of the population, simple arithmetic suggests no.
And what about Trudeau? Did he talk about electoral reform?
He ran in 2015 suggesting he wanted to bring in electoral reform, but the proposal that he brought in, which was basically a 2-round vote so that each MP had to have a majority of votes cast in the riding, was so transparently self-serving that neither the New Democrats nor the Conservatives felt they could go along with it without hurting themselves.
Now, a Research Co. exit poll asked Canadian voters about the possibility of changing our electoral system. And the party list proportional representation system got the thumbs up from 51% of Canadian voters, 18% disagreed, and 28% were undecided. Can you explain how the party list proportional representation system works?
Well, you can design it in a number of ways, but most simply, it means that each party draws up a list of candidates for each jurisdiction. In Canada, that would mean each province has its own list because we are still a federal country. And the percentage of the vote that you get in that province or territory is the percentage of the seats you get after adjustments for a minimal threshold, 4%, 5%, something like that.
Now, there's also that mixed member proportional representation. I understand you were mentioning a bit of a hybrid system. If Canada would have that mixed member proportional representation system, how would that really have affected the election outcome?
Well, mixed member proportional is a 2-level system where you have some constituency reps and some party list reps, and the party list reps even out the proportion of voters. So the Conservatives would have gotten roughly the number of seats they got. all things being equal, in the last federal election, the Liberals would have had about 40 fewer. The New Democrats would have had about 35 more, and the Greens would have had about 15 more. So there's absolutely no chance, given the debates that were going on, that the Conservatives could have formed a government.
So Andrew Scheer recently survived leadership within his own caucus. Many MPs saying they support Andrew Scheer moving forward. Let's see what happens with the leadership review in April. But what about Justin Trudeau? I mean, how come a lot of the Liberal MPs are not calling for his head, considering you went from a majority to a minority?
When you win, you're still in charge. And bottom line is, he exceeded expectations in the election after, in effect, running down the brand for the year before that. And when you win, forgiveness comes first. Teamwork comes first. Parties that tear themselves apart, be in government, be in opposition, tend to lose the next election.
Like it says in the Bible, right? A kingdom divided against itself cannot stand. How about the NDP and Jagmeet Singh? He lost 15 seats, yet on election night, I saw him jumping up and down and everybody was celebrating.
Well, they were expecting to be wiped out in Quebec, and they were taken down to 1 seat, but they hung on to the furniture in British Columbia, Manitoba, and Ontario, and so while they didn't meet the expectations they had worked up during the campaign, they were better off than when they started at the beginning of the campaign.
Because the Liberals were shut out of both Alberta and Saskatchewan, how much will this hurt the prairies, do you think?
Well, the federal government cannot run against a region of the country for 4 years without creating huge problems for itself going down the road. The Liberals were averaging 13% across the prairies. So Mr. Trudeau has to show that he can come up with some national compromises. That probably means building Trans Mountain, if his lawyers ever show up in court. It means implementing the carbon tax. That was the original trade-off.
January, we can look forward to seeing that here in Alberta.
Yes.
That was the promise.
And Mr. Kenney showed that he recognized that was coming by bringing in his large emitter carbon tax, which he calls something else, at $30, not $20, which he had talked about in the campaign. So he knows that's going to be the price. He knows that most of that amount will be rebated to ordinary citizens, more so if you're not driving a gas guzzler. And so he's taken that into account.
There seemed to be a lot of divisiveness this last federal election. The country seems more divided now than ever before. We see Wexit, coming on strong right now. They've put their papers in through Elections Canada. They want to be recognized as an official federal party here in Canada. What is needed to bridge that divide between Ottawa and the prairies?
Well, it's not just Ottawa and the prairies. Quebec is in its own reality and has been increasingly so the last 15 years. And British Columbia has several different realities, depending on which part of the province you're talking about.
That's so true, because the mindset of people in the Okanagan is so much different from the people on the Lower Mainland and the island.
Absolutely. There's at least 4 different markets in British Columbia. Core Vancouver, the island and the coastal region, the interior, and then the outer Vancouver suburbs. And they all voted different ways during the election.
Now, how about a partyless proportional representation system? How would that really have affected the election outcome?
It is hard to say, because we don't know, first of all, what the threshold to get elected is, and we don't know how many unchained egos in each of the parties would try to blackmail their way up to the top of the list by threatening to form their own parties. This is what has happened in a lot of other countries. You have people playing the game in order to position their own faction to get seats in whether as small parties or as multi-party coalitions. And so you have a lot more backroom deals between politicians and parties. And if you're looking for accountability, whether for party leaders or for local members to actual real voters, party list systems don't give it to you.
Why do you think it is that Prime Minister Justin Trudeau said He's went on record to say that he doesn't want to form a coalition with another party. He's willing to work with the other parties.
I think that's an entirely sensible thing to do. That way he's prime minister. He hasn't mortgaged his program to any one political party, but he can, like Stephen Harper before him, bring some proposals in that will get conservative support, other proposals in that will get New Democrat support, and try to establish or reestablish the Liberals as a center party and not an ideological party of the left. And that's the only way that the Liberals can continue to govern the country without destroying national unity.
Do you think the Liberals can last 4 years, or were we looking at more like 2 years till we see the next election?
Historically, it has been closer to 2 years during minority governments, but Mr. Harper lasted 3 or almost 3 between 2008 and 2011.
Explain to our viewers exactly, Dr. Hale, what it takes to bring down the government.
Government has to lose a confidence vote. So they can do that in one of two ways. They can either miscalculate, as Joe Clark did in 1979, and not have the votes to pass a measure they call a measure of confidence, or they can deliberately set up a budget or some other confidence vote to challenge the opposition parties to throw them out of office, having polling data that suggests that they can win an election.
Do you think we'll ever see, getting back to electoral reform, will we ever see that happening in Canada?
You never say never, but every time somebody has come out with a proposal, all the people who have something to lose, all the communities that have something to lose as a result of electoral reform, will turn out en masse against it. Whereas the average voter who doesn't really care one way or the other probably will not turn out in large numbers. And the people who gain will often take their gains for granted. That's what's happened in British Columbia. That's what's happened in Ontario. That's what happened just last fall in Prince Edward Island. We'll see what happens in Quebec. I think we will have to have at least one major province change its electoral system in a way that provides an example for the federal government to see any kind of electoral reform in Canada in the foreseeable future.
How much of a role do you think expats and recent immigrants to Canada played in the last election when it comes to their votes?
I haven't seen any data on recent immigrants, but the expatriate vote, I'd have to look at the numbers to see how they are calculated by the returning officers.
Do most countries in the world allow expats to vote, or is that kind of rare?
There are about 90 countries in the world that do allow expatriates to vote, but there's a lot of different rules. You can have a situation like France and Italy have, where expatriates actually elect their own members of the national legislature. You can have a situation where they can cast mail ballots for a limited period of time, where they have to show up at an embassy or a consulate to vote, or they can have a time-limited right to vote. The federal conservatives brought that in before 2015. The courts threw it out, so I don't think we'll see that here.
Dr. Hale, how does that work when it comes to the Senate seats? I understand that the Maritimes have more seats than Alberta, even though we have more of a population?
Well, the Senate was set up as a vehicle for regional representation in the 19th century, and it reflected 19th century population distributions, more or less. So the Maritimes had 24, Ontario and Quebec had 24. When the four western provinces came in between 1870 and 1905, they got 24, and then they threw in another 6 for Newfoundland, another 3 for the territories. So given the fact that the Supreme Court has ruled that provinces must agree to any changes in their representation, the Senate is set in amber just as much as the representation in the House of Commons for smaller populations or smaller provinces with declining populations.
The Green Party's gone on record during the last election as well, talking about lowering the voting age to 16. Let's talk about the pros and cons of that.
Well, that idea has been kicked around, but the age at which you're considered an adult has changed a little bit over the years, but not that much. During the 1970s, Most countries reduce the voting age from 21 to 18 because they said that if you are old enough to fight and die for your country, you should be able to at least choose your government and the government that's going to send you there. So the question is, at what point are people taking up the responsibilities of citizenship to the point that the right to vote should be generalized? I think if you look at social media these days, the age of adulthood is pretty relaxed. For some people, it's 15. For other people, like perhaps the current resident in the White House, it can be north of 70. But the reality is that if you are prepared to take adult responsibilities, voting becomes normal. 16-year-olds so far are still dependents. They still aren't out on their own for the most part. Therefore, I think it'll be a while before we see 16-year-olds voting.
Dr. Geoffrey Hale, political science professor from the University of Lethbridge, thanks a lot for joining me again in studio.
My pleasure.